All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry we're a bit behind, but everyone is filtering in, and I've just discussed with our speakers this morning, Matthew Rojansky and Sebastien Peyrouse, that we are kind of the studio audience, if you would, for a larger audience that will view our proceedings or have the opportunity to view our proceedings when they're recorded and posted to the website. But welcome to our fall conference entitled The Near Abroad, Russia's Neighbors or Victims. The origin of this conference title actually was in our spring conference, which many of you attended at the Cosmos Club, where we talked about Iran as really being either at the root of or kind of accelerant for every problem that we face nowadays in the Middle East. Well, as it happens, the countries that are once upon a time called newly independent countries around Russia's periphery also face a host of problems, some more acute than others, some more violent than others, some more threatening than others, but they all face a range of problems. And it seems somehow, if you think about it or look into it, and that's what we intend to do today, look into it more deeply, these problems have a common source, and that is, or at least an exacerbator, and that is their big neighbor and once upon a time ruler, Russia. So we want to kind of take that proposition apart in a little bit more detail with a little bit more focus by experts on these countries that are often overlooked until they appear for a flash in the news over some momentary eruption, contested election, violent incursion, something like that, and then they fade from view. But what goes on there doesn't fade from their view, it persists as problems. And so for that, we have in our first panel today invited Matthew Rojansky, who is the president and chief executive officer of the U.S. Russia Foundation, but has previously served as director of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center and is deeply experienced in our topic, and Professor Sebastien Peyrouse. Dr. Peyrouse is the director of the Central Asia Program and research professor in European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University, and a researcher, I should say, at UCAN, the European Central Asian Monitoring Organization in Brussels. And we're going to do this in a kind of fireside chat format. I'll ask questions, and hopefully in the first question, evoke some kind of opening remarks or scene-setting remarks from both Matthew and Sebastien, and then dig a little deeper with a few more questions, and then turn to your questions. So with that, Matthew, maybe I could ask you to start. If we were in Moscow today and talking to people connected with Russian government, how do Russians think about their bordering neighbors who constitute the near abroad? How do they even think about that?
Thank you for having me, Ambassador Hughes, and thank you to all of you. Can you hear me in the back? Great. You know, I have spent the overwhelming majority of my 2 and change decade career in Washington, not in the Foreign Service, but working for either Foreign Service officers or ambassadors, former ambassadors. So in fact, I currently work for a number of former ambassadors. So I feel very at home in the language of American diplomacy. And I'm really pleased with that question because, of course, one thing I learned from one of my first bosses and still a mentor to me, Ambassador Jim Collins, who served in Moscow and a number of other places, was that type of question, how is it seen over there, is one of the single biggest values you bring back to Washington as an ambassador you should be communicating. I should warn you, for a host of reasons, I used to wear, I joked, I used to wear a groove in the carpet of Frankfurt Airport because I went so many times to Moscow and Kiev and Berlin and so on. Because of first COVID and now the war, which has resulted in both my organization, U.S. Russia Foundation, my former organization, the Wilson Center and the Kennan Institute, and myself personally being added to Russia's sanctions list, I haven't been back to Russia since 2019. So you have to take with a grain of salt that I process information through many of the same kinds of sources that anyone else would be able to. That said, of course, I read the Russian press. One of the things we do at the U.S. Russia Foundation is we support a healthy and independent Russian media now in exile, which we hope is a temporary state. So here's my read. Number one, I pretty much exclude survey data about what Russians think about the war, about Ukraine, about the United States, or almost anything else. And the reason is fairly simple, which is imagine that you are, Victor Andreevich sitting in your house and you get a call on your phone, probably your cell phone, which is very traceable. And they say, Victor Andreevich, this is the, State Survey Corporation. We're calling with a few questions for you. You say, okay. They say, question number one, do you approve or disapprove of Vladimir Putin? They know who you are and they know where you are, and they're asking you what you think of the leader. What do you think you're going to say? What's incredible to me is that anyone answers anything other than, I love him and I support him and he's wonderful and please can I go now? And you can extrapolate from there. So generally speaking, there are many, many other indicators that are important. For example, self-organizing civic activity, social media commentary, apolitical demonstrations of opposition. But for the most part, survey data is not a useful indicator. We have to look at other things. I generally think that the Russian public turns more than anything to apathy in the face of a regime which defines such a confrontational outlook, such a confrontational path towards the wider outside world. In other words, and again, this is just a basic strategic empathy exercise. If you lived in Russia and your ability to travel and work and communicate in the world depended on the good grace and forbearance of your government, just as it does for us here in the United States, we have to get passports, we're nominally not supposed to practice a private foreign policy, to go through the government, et cetera. If the government takes the kind of position that I don't think I even have to tell you what the official position of the Kremlin is towards Ukraine, towards the United States, et cetera. It's on, glaring display today as our embassy is being evacuated and people are locked down in fear of a retaliatory Russian missile strike, probably targeting Americans, by the way. At this point, I'd be highly confident that the Kremlin seeks to kill Americans in Ukraine, not outside. Then what are you going to do? Even a thoughtful, educated, worldly Russian, my friends, my dear friends of years and years in Russia, what are they going to do? They're going to turn apathetic. They're going to disconnect from an outlook on the outside world. Now, I would very much defer to Sebastien on Central Asia and frankly, the whole rest of the former Soviet region. I would simply say there are exceptions, but they're not exceptions where the perspective is necessarily that of, a neighbor to a neighbor. It is definitely shaped by the history that Russia has with, the Republic of Georgia, right? There's an incredible, we could do 1,000 years of history there, but with a lot of kind of pendulum swinging back and forth between, resentment and conflict and, frankly, terrifyingly close partnership to the point that the KGB, sometimes the FSB has had, free reign within Georgia on many issues. Russians have looked at this country as something like a younger brother or a natural extension of the Russian cultural space, even though by many measures, this place couldn't be more different, right? Hot-blooded where Russia is cold-blooded and, kind of tiny and sort of, prickly where Russia is huge and expansive and multi-ethnic. So that's just one example. The Ukraine case we could talk about, we'll have probably a follow-up question on that in much greater detail. One other interesting one worth highlighting So I spent quite a big chunk of my career working on Belarus, sort of the forgotten European country. 10 million people living in essentially a kind of warmed over Bolshevik dictatorship. Interestingly about Belarus, by the way, some of the more positive or at least popular features of the Soviet Union were preserved alongside all the negatives. And one of those is that Belarus really doesn't have oligarchs because they never did the wild 1990s. They still have state collective farms. They still have kind of state-owned industry. There's actually pretty decent industry producing sophisticated optics and light manufactured goods and so on, as well as, of course, agriculture. And so a lot of the Belarusian people feel very comfortable slotting into that same kind of apathy and indifference, which is to say, I don't really need to get involved in this big outer world because life in Belarus, thank God, maybe we're not as rich as the Muscovites, but at least we're not Ukraine, right? No one's attacking us and dropping bombs on our cities, and we all have electricity and we have gas in our villages and so on. Public education works. I personally, my life was saved by Belarusian doctors in one of these Soviet hospitals. It was a super Soviet experience, but I had a very serious infection once when I was there, and they operated on me and saved my life. And so I can, I'm here to attest it's not comfortable. The Belarusian healthcare system works. So this is a case where you have a near neighbor of Russia that could not be closer on paper. And yet the attitude, I think, on both sides is, we don't really want to have to deal with the politics of this relationship. We don't want to think about each other. We turn inward and we look at our lives.
I want to dig deeper into a number of things that you said, but let's ask Sebastien the same question. How do you think, and maybe Sebastien, you could, because Matthew took off on the tack of public opinion in Russia, and I was actually really kind of asking for leader opinion in Russia. How do leaders in Russia think about these neighbors? Do they think about them as, like, we think of Canada and Mexico, or do they think about them more like, that was once ours, and it could be again, or something in between, or however you would characterize it?
Well, I think that actually leaders in Central Asia view Russia and Moscow.
I think maybe you'll need to speak up more.
Oh,
maybe
sorry.
move the microphone up or something like that, or just hold it.
Can you hear me? All right, thank you. Sorry about that. So yeah, I would have to say that Central Asian leaders view Russia, but as a kind of unavoidable country, because they have to deal with it, and at the same time, to trying to take some distance to build their own policy. For plenty of reasons. Here, I'm going to echo, for example, what Matthew just said. If you want to understand the present Central Asia, you need to look at the past. Central Asia was integrated into the Tsarist Empire from the 18th, 19th centuries and the Soviet Union. And this still has a lot of impact on how Central Asia governments are managing the country, but also on how Russia is viewing the Central Asian countries. And something important, again, to understand how these countries are working. Under the Soviet Union, Central Asia became kind of resource-based and buffer zone. And I know Central Asia provided energy and also raw materials, which were serving and was viewed, as strategic frontier for Russia against external threats. Now, of course, we are in 2024. The situation changed a lot, of course, but and each state, has, as I said, trying to develop its own policies, trying to balance its relationship with other partners around the region, but even beyond. But that being said, I would say that Russia still remains a very important partner for Asian countries on very different level. First, of course, on the economic level. Russia remains one of the largest economic partners in terms of trade. And if you look at the geography of the region, all Central Asian states are landlocked, meaning that for Central Asian countries which are heavily dependent on transit routes for trade, many of these routes are actually going through Russia. And one example here is for Kazakhstan. The economy of Kazakhstan relies heavily on the export of oil, and 80% of Kazakhstan's exports of oil goes through the Cascade Consortium pipeline, which is going through Russia, which of course gives Russia a lot of possibilities to influence and even capacity to blackmail, to blackmail Kazakhstan. Just to give you an example, in 2022, when the president of Kazakhstan refused to endorse Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin turned off, stopped the flow going through the consumption, pipeline consortium, sorry, and Putin turned it off several times. One other very important element, for Central Asian leaders, but also for Central Asian population when they look at Russia, that's remittances and migration. So you have 3 countries in Central Asia who are heavily dependent on remittances, being Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Every year you have more than about between 3 and 5 million of Central Asians who are going to work in Central Asia. And of course, this in Russia, in Russia. And of course, this gives Russia again some strong influence some strong capacity of influence. In terms of security, here again, I guess that's an important point, because Central Asian countries, and especially leaders of Central Asian countries, still rely a lot on Russian capacity to protect the borders or to intervene in case of, I don't know, attack from the Taliban or any kind of destabilization. So you have a lot of bilateral security agreements which were signed with Russia, but also you have the CSTO, so the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which still plays for Central Asian countries. 3 of them, a big role, wide 3 of them, because only Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan are part of it. Uzbekistan withdrew in 2012, and Turkmenistan never really joined it. But this organization has been able to conduct some training, some military exercises. It also sells some military equipment to Central Asian countries for much cheaper price than any other organization, security organization, or than any other countries. Well, of course, there have been, and I can come back on that later, but there have been some other organizations which Central Asian countries are involved, but so far their impact is kind of limited. For NATO, why? Because Russia and China have been putting a lot of pressure on Central Asian countries to limit their relations with NATO. Or you also have the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but which is not like a NATO organization, doesn't really have kind of well-structured security engagement. And also because I can come back to that, but because also this organization being dominated both by Russia and by China, you have strong reluctance to have China playing a big role in terms of security in the region. And then another important point here is that we also have strong cultural links between Russia and Central Asia. The first one is because of Russian language. Here again, I can come back on that in the discussion, but Russian language, the practice of Russian language decreased in the 1990s, but it's increasing again for many reasons. One of the main ones being, of course, that with so many migrants from Central Asia going to Russia, they need to speak Russian. You also have Russian media, which are still very present in the region. Plus, Russia is conducting kind of strong soft security policy, soft power policy, excuse me. Through many ways, including by having tens of thousands of Central Asian students in its universities every year, plus supporting local education and local cultural events, etc. So all of that, this has an impact, of course, on the leaders, how they manage their contracted foreign relations. Russia is definitely supporting the authoritarianism in the region. Supporting authoritarian regimes that align with Moscow goals. That being said, also I would like to say that authoritarianism in Central Asia, does not result only from Russian influence. We have also other countries, and again, I can come back on that. Also countries which are having an influence, especially in terms of supporting authoritarianism in the region. I'm thinking first of all about China, but again, if you look at the geography, you have Iran, or a little bit further, you have Turkey, all these countries which are not necessarily supporting a lot the democratization of these countries. And another point is that all these countries are by themselves. They don't necessarily need to be pushed too much to be authoritarian. They are all very authoritarian, and for years they have restricted freedom of expression, freedom of association. All of these systems are neo-patrimonial systems, meaning that changing the system would probably change not only the regime security, but the financial sense of the people who are in power. So basically, I'm probably going to stop here, but just basically what I wanted to say is very briefly, based on your question, that's right now. Russia still plays a big role in the region.
Well, and certainly what your remarks have underscored is that the way the near abroad is viewed by Russian leaders is complicated. It's not unidimensional. It has all of these elements of economic cooperation, potential for economic pressure, security and strategic considerations, and so forth. So, in a word, it's complicated. But let me next turn back to Matthew and say, frankly, I wasn't planning on a follow-up question about Ukraine per se. We've actually had a series of conferences in the immediate aftermath of the invasion about Ukraine, and I'm sure it will filter in and out of our view here. But I wanted to look at a little bit the forgotten country, Belarus. We said provocatively, well, the increasingly apathetic and disconnected Belarusian population is taking the view, well, at least we're not Ukraine. Well, that's a contemporary view of Ukraine, isn't it? Because bombs are falling now, but they weren't falling 4 years ago. Would the Belarusians have compared themselves more favorably to the Ukrainians when Ukraine wasn't being attacked and invaded by Russia? Say earlier, before 2014, before the annexation of seizure of Crimea, because Belarus has had this peculiarly close relationship with Moscow, closer maybe than any of the other former Russian states, former Russian republics. But my perception before 2019 or 2020 was that Lukashenko was under increasing pressure from Russia to kind of knuckle under, to give more permissions for the Russians to operate in his country or to have more free reign in his country. And he was trying, I thought, to maneuver against that. I read anyway some commentaries in that direction. And that all seems to have collapsed, and he's practically, surrendered to Moscow is my impression. What's going on there? What's that all about?
Yeah, so let me preface this by apologizing. Yeah, I think the answer I gave you before was very focused on perspectives of the people populations. That's what I think a lot about in my work now. I think Sebastian's overview of kind of the official level was basically right, but I also don't want to tell a group of eminent folks like you all things that you probably already know. But stop me and ask me if you think I'm missing something. I find Belarus really fascinating. I think your assessment's basically right up until 2020, and pretty amazingly so when you consider the number of completely rigged, in some cases violence, such as 2010 when I was in Minsk, elections that Lukashenko has run to stay in power for 35 years. Up until 2020, he nonetheless had the ability to play East against West. So yes, peculiarly close to Russia in the sense that it is actually really technically Russia's only treaty ally. It's part of a unitary government such that when you land in either country, you fill out the same customs arrival form that says Russian Federation and Republic of Belarus government on it. Technically, therefore, travel between the two is internal travel, although now, because of the war, they are checking passports and documents because of people dodging the draft. What changed in 2020, some of you may remember, was 1 million people, reliably so. One can debate crowd sizes, but 1 million, no contemporary American political reference there, but 1 million people came out on the street in Minsk. And, this is a country of, as I said, 9 million people. So, proportionally, that's what is, I can't do the math, like 28 million Americans, right? That's an enormous, enormous number of people. And they basically protested in favor of the opposition candidate, who's now in exile, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and really against Lukashenko. And the reason that this was a watershed, that had happened before, not at that scale, but the reason this was a watershed is that moment foreclosed Lukashenko's ability for the foreseeable future, though he's a survivor, to play East against West. And when he doesn't have the ability to play East against West, then this idea that he's the guarantor of Belarusian sovereignty, so why look to Moscow, right? You don't need to look to Moscow because you've got Lukashenko and he can always swing closer to the West and get money into the East, or he can swing closer to Moscow. He became wholly reliant on Moscow. And I'll bet you a number of you have experienced this in your postings. When you have a leader who is, for any number of those complex, interwoven set of interests, economic, security, political reasons, dependent on another leader, why go through the middleman? Just go to the source. And so the message, this is vitally important for, Belarusian elites. I said there are no oligarchs, but that doesn't mean there aren't elites, right? There are security elites, there are economic elites, there are cultural elites. Is the real boss is in Moscow. So we don't need this guy in the middle. And so he's in a much more precarious position now than he was in prior to 2020. And the next thing that's slated to happen is he's actually called elections for January of 2025. Tactically, he always does them at the coldest possible part of the winter time to try to deter protest encampments and large gatherings of people on the streets. I mean, wouldn't you? This is all happening in the midst of a war where in fact, Putin is using Belarusian territory for his aggression against Ukraine, although the Ukrainians have been really careful about not responding in ways that would kind of force Belarus's hand to become more directly engaged, though I think that may be inevitable. So the question over the next month, 2 months really, is does Moscow throw its weight behind Lukashenko? And if so, in exchange for what? And it's very likely to be in exchange for ramped up North Korea type involvement in the war. Or does Moscow pick a successor, recognizing that, at this point, Lukashenko is not only long in the tooth, but also maybe of limited use to them. And I can't actually predict where that will go. Only to say, they call him Tsigan, the gypsy, because he is really an incredible survivor. This is the Belarusian nickname for Lukashenko. He was a collective farm director. He plays politics down to its local level masterfully, so he may well survive. In terms of how the Belarusian people would have viewed Ukraine before the conflict, I stand by what I said earlier, and this goes for Belarusians and Russians. I think we really overstated the case. I served in as a scholar attached to Embassy Kiev in the immediate run-up to the Maidan in 2013. Lived in the center of Kiev, spent all my time immersed in the community of folks, both government people and then also people who went to the Maidan and led those protests. And I can tell you that as excited as we Americans all were about the freedom in Ukraine, the sense from ordinary Russians, Belarusians, and others in the neighborhood looking at Ukraine was not like, oh, we'd love to have some of that too. It was much more, that's interesting. I can see how this goes sideways, and gosh, that seems like an awful lot of chaos and fighting between the different oligarchic factions. That was always the big story in Ukraine, was the corruption and the battles among the oligarchic groups, which is not to in any way dismiss how important a moment that was for Ukraine, but just this, again, this is probably something you all remember very well, that hope of infection, of contagion, from the Arab Spring, et cetera, that was much less of a thing than we might have thought it was at the time.
So that didn't look attractive to Belarusians, it looked scary.
Well, and again, remember, this is not like a perfect petri dish experiment, right? People are intervening, right? We had officials going there and doing various things, like maybe handing out sandwiches and so on, and cookies. And the Russians intervened in big ways, money, possibly fomenting violence, on the Maidan itself. And so populations in the region are seeing all of this happen. And they are thinking, even at that moment of great hope and democratic kind of flourishing in Ukraine, they are thinking, ooh, yeah, I'd maybe rather not have this in my neighborhood.
Okay, let's go to the opposite end, if you would, of the former Soviet Empire, and talk about another country with Sebastien that also has played East against West, and arguably more successfully, Kazakhstan. And I'd like to ask you, Sebastien, to sort of expand on and contrast. Well, Nursultan Nazarbayev has now, he's finished, he's left office, he's been replaced, I can't even remember the president's name, but Nazarbayev for decades had also long-running act in government, had a reputation for being able to fairly successfully play East against West to preserve a measure of independence despite Kazakhstan's dependence on transiting its most important export through Russian territory. Yet, of course, within the last 3 years, as I recall, Russian troops were called in to Kazakhstan to quell disturbances. And as you said, there's always sensitivity in Moscow about any of these peripheral countries getting too close to NATO. So I'd like to ask you to sort of talk about Kazakhstan's trajectory in this East versus West effort to preserve independent space, but also to talk about that NATO and China relationship. Because Russia's sensitivity about these countries getting too close to NATO is obviously a sensitivity about invading their space and security. Isn't China's sensitivity about that different? I think I would have thought China's sensitivity about it would be less of a military threat reaching all the way to China through Central Asian countries, but rather China wants these in its own sphere of influence. You mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So maybe you could expand on those themes for us with the farthest flung Central Asian country.
Yeah, so thank you, Ambassador. There's a lot here.
Yes.
To address, but yes, that's definitely true. Kazakhstan is really the example of a country which has been really working and in a way managing pretty well diverse relations. You know, from the very beginning, Kazakhstan said that Nazarbayev and said that he would implement what he called the multi-factor policy. So that meant, of course, having some good relations with Russia, keeping good relations with Russia, which was unavoidable, but also developing relations with other countries. The first one being China, which had an increasing influence in the region, plus, again, playing, as you said, or balancing really relations with Western countries, so with the United States and with European Union countries. So in very, very different sectors, you know, in the economic sectors, as I said, Kazakhstan was really trying to be less dependent of Russia, being so much connected, you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union to this country. So we're really trying, you know, to diversify its trade exchanges and with China, but also beyond that, with Turkey, with Iran, and so on. In terms also of security, because here again, Russia has been trying to put a lot of pressure on Kazakhstan and all of the Central Asian countries to keep Kazakhstan and all the region under its military security influence, as I said, through the CSTO, also going to the NATO, going a little bit to the SU, and I'll come back on that, but again, with a limited impact. And also, you know, trying to have, again, I was saying that Kazakhstan still has strong cultural links with Russia. On the other hand, Nazarbayev, so the previous president, and the current president, Tokayev, have been really trying also to diversify their cultural relations by also engaging much more with Western universities, by trying to develop the teaching of English language in the region. So, I mean, and again, try really, in a way, something that first President Nazarbayev and President Tokayev systematically emphasized: we want a multi-vector policy. And Russia was more or less accepting that. Now, that being said, you know, when you look at the concrete results, where we are now, if you look at, for example, the economic, the trade and the economic figures for Kazakhstan, or even beyond Kazakhstan, for all Central Asia, it is true that Kazakhstan and all the other countries have been able to diversify their economic relations. But if you look at the trade figures, as I was saying, Russia remains by far one of the main economic partners of all the region. The first one actually now since 2008 is China, with about, you have about, and it depends, I mean, it changes from one year to another, but you have between, I would say, 60 and 80 billion of dollars of trade exchanges between China and Central Asia. Then comes Russia, which is at about between 40 and 50 million. And then much, much lower comes Turkey, which is between 10 and 15 million. And then the West, the European Union has a very big role in the region. Why? Because the European Union buys a lot of products, especially oil and gas. But beyond that, I mean, the trade exchanges between the European Union and Kazakhstan and Central Asia are pretty limited. And the same actually for the United States. You know, when you look at the trade figures between the United States and Central Asia, it must be about $3 billion, and most of it actually goes with Kazakhstan. But still, you know, we are much lower. And yes, in terms of security, well, I mean, China, you know, how Russia and China are viewing the region for a long time, you know, and still today, in a way, Russia and China have a kind of agreement. Russia manages, if I may say, the security of the region, Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries, and China engages much more in the economic sector. So what does that mean is that China was not against seeing Russia being having influence through bilateral agreements, through the CSTO, but at the same time trying also to push a little bit more the SCO to have a bigger role in this sector with some limited impact, because again, as I was saying, the image of China is, I mean, raises many questions in Kazakhstan, and in the region. You know, you were mentioning ambassadors at the CES events in January 2022 in Kazakhstan when President Tokayev asked the CSTO to send troops, and that was mostly Russian troops, but if I remember well, there's probably some Belarusian troops too. But that was pretty acceptable by the local populations to see Russian troops. Why? Because the narrative had said, we know that, we know how they behave. It would be much more difficult for China to send troops. It is true that China has been trying to be more engaged in the security sector in the region, in Kazakhstan and in the other countries, but they remain pretty discreet. You know, we talked, I mean, a lot, already 2 or 3 years, about the Chinese bases, that military bases that China opened in Tajikistan. From the very beginning, China tried to hide that, and the government of Tajikistan tried to hide that just because they were really worried about the reaction. So again, you have a kind of agreement, you know, but again, against indeed the NATO. I mean, neither Russia, neither China wants to see the NATO and the West to have a strong influence, not only in the military sector, as well, but also, and I can come back on that if you want, but also in many other sectors, especially in terms of political influence, democratization.
That's a very interesting observation. Many interesting observations there, but especially the notion of a kind of a economic security, Chinese, Russian condominium, so to speak, in relation to Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries. An intriguing concept. Let's turn back to Matthew for a moment and look at a different aspect of the near abroad. I want to ask another question or two, and then we'll open the floor, maybe 1 or 2 questions and a final observation, and we'll open the floor to questions. Your questions. Among the countries of the near abroad, there are big or bigger countries, and there are a collection of little countries, 2 collections of little countries, specifically the Baltics and the Caucasus. Their fates have been very different. The Baltics have been by far the most successful of the former Soviet republics in their free independent period. I mean, economically, and even in terms of political stability and relative freedom from Russian retaliation, bullying, direct overt political interference. The Caucasus have had a tragic fate, actually, in their independence period, between frozen conflicts, specifically Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russian invasion or partial seizure of territory in the case of Georgia. You could say, well, the one obvious thing that's different about these 2 groups, apart from the fact that they're in widely separated places, is that the Baltics are members of NATO and the others aren't. But is there any more to it than that? Can you talk about the smaller countries in the near abroad and their respective destinies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating question, and you could look at a few different lenses for this, right? One would be, yeah, nominally these 6 republics, right? So, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Baltic region, and then Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia in the South Caucasus, right? The North Caucasus are also a bunch of ethnically distinct republics, but they're part of the Russian Federation still. The main reason that it ended up that way is that sort of by Stalinist happenstance, those republics were part of the Soviet Russian Federation, and the South Caucasus ones had been Transcaucasia and became their own kind of ethno-republics within the Soviet Union. Bit of a historical accident. One could argue that process is still ongoing, right? We might see an independent nation of Dagestan and Chechnya or what have you in the future. In Soviet times, they were very much seen as distinct. So when you would visit Tallinn as a Soviet citizen, you were visiting Europe in a way, not radically unlike if you were visiting Prague or Budapest. Sure, it's communist Europe and it's Soviet Europe, and you don't need a external passport to go there, but it was not Russia, not your core kind of Muscovite Soviet Union. And very similarly, if you went to the Caucasus, which people did, vacations and conferences and things, you were clearly in a different place. Whether it was Europe or not was always sort of debatable, but it was a different place. They had that in common. Their distinctness was preserved. There was this superficial Soviet overlay of the titular nationalities always had to kind of run the republics with the Russian looking over their shoulder. And then with a lot of variation, it was broadly true that from the 60s all the way through peaking in the 80s and early 90s, they all had pretty significant national independence movements. So the Baltics famously sort of holding hands across the Baltics, the Singing Revolution. There was even significant violent resistance in Lithuania in the 1950s and even into the 60s. But actually, you had that stuff in the Caucasus too, right? Like you had, people shot on the streets of Tbilisi and Yerevan. Less so. Baku was very Sovietized, but not zero for sure. There was a significant, Azeri kind of independence, cultural, intellectual movement, and so on. So, which all of this begs the question, why such different fates? Which, by the way, isn't to say that the Caucasus, the Baltics, you correctly summarized, they're NATO, they're EU members, they're super close to the United States. One could argue they're almost kind of running the EU nowadays, right? You've got former Prime Minister of Estonia is the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy. Former Prime Minister of Lithuania is the EU's Defense Commissioner, and former Prime Minister of Latvia is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission in charge of trade. So actually, the Baltics have done extremely well for a region of less than 10 million people.
For 3 countries that don't summarize a major metropolitan area for one of the larger countries.
Riga is a pretty big place, but in full disclosure, my father-in-law is Estonian, so I may be slightly biased here, but they've done very, very well. Why has that not been the case with the South Caucasus? I mean, I think geography is the massive factor you just can't get around. A lot of things happened to work in the Baltic countries' favor. Finland kind of adopted Estonia. Poland and Lithuania were a bit of a kind of package deal in many ways with Europe. Latvia was the toughest in the sense that it always had the largest, because of Riga, it had the largest ethnic Russian population, and they didn't leave. They were very happy to stay there. Riga is a great place. But you ended up with these tensions that continue to this day, which is they're consuming Russian media from Russia. So their worldview is very much shaped by Russian media. Many of them still to this day don't speak Latvian. And that's a real sticking point for the Latvian government. So you had this issue of, do you grant people full citizenship, right to vote, full passport, etc., if they don't speak the national language? Doesn't that erode your identity, which in a tiny place like Latvia or Estonia, it really causes a lot of discomfort. But by and large, very, very fortunate due to geography. South Caucasus, much less so, who are their neighbors, like Turkey, Iran, Russia. Whew, that's a tough neighborhood. And so it's always left, for example, even the kind of virulently pro-Western government of Georgia under Misha Saakashvili, many other flaws, but very, very pro-Western, really out there. You can declare that you're going to be in NATO, but there's like 1,000 miles of Black Sea and non-NATO space between you and NATO armies.
Well, and
so
ultimately that was provocative enough for him to be crushed.
as it turned out, yeah. I mean, other things
including
happen.
personally.
Yes, yeah. Well, and he contributed to that too. I'm not a great fan. For those who followed, the disclosures of actual torture, under that government in Georgia, one has to look a little bit critically at them as well. But where Georgia's gone today is a direct result of that. That point, I want to correct something, or maybe qualify something I said earlier. I didn't want to be dismissive about the significance for Russians, for other people in the former Soviet region, of what happened in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. It's just that it wasn't unidimensional, right? There was a breath of freedom. People were very excited about what the potential of that promised. But Georgia is another really important example of voters with plenty of propaganda and manipulation and all the rest of it, nonetheless, being pretty sophisticated and looking at what has happened since then, looking at the real reality that they can't escape, which is that there's this giant, great power called Russia that has intervened and killed people in Ukraine, and they don't want that. And so I'm not saying it's a good thing, but people are smart. And so whether they're Belarusians or Georgians or Armenians, they look very pragmatically at what has happened in Ukraine. And they say, we might want to sit this one out, let's see. And they make these other choices, as a result of which we've just had a very pro-Russian government reelected in Georgia in an imperfect election, but nonetheless an election. And so I do think it's a reflection that hope, that fantasy, frankly, of, if you will, the Arab Spring wildfire, sweeping through the post-Soviet space and bringing, Maidan-style revolutions of dignity everywhere. It just didn't come to pass, or at least not yet. And the way that I would kind of tie this all up and put a policy stamp on it is to say, it just reinforces you have to do your homework in every single place. The local population, in partnership with the United States, in partnership with Europe. It's not enough to say, look, Ukraine, here, we're putting a bunch of money in there, it's working out, so everyone else do that. Because exactly like Sebastien explained it, they've got neighbors, they've got internal issues, they have their own strongmen to contend with. It's the old Anna Karenina principle, right? Each unhappy family is unhappy
In its own way. Let me turn back to Sebastien. We talked about Kazakhstan, but there's the other part of Central Asia, Kazakhstan being the richest, the most oil-rich, the most, I guess you could say, geostrategic of the former Soviet republics that have been sometimes referred to by scholars as the disaster stands. The others, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, they're much more economically dependent and much weaker. Could you talk a little bit about what you think their inevitable fate may be in the world that's emerging with Russia invading one of its former republics, and with the aim apparently of either incorporating it back into Russia or completely satellitizing it? So what about the rest of the disaster stand? What is their fate?
So thank you very much, and that's a very important question when we look at Central Asia from the United States or from the European Union. It's very important. So in my introductory remarks, I was talking about Central Asia, but we really need to take into account the big differences between all the Central Asian countries. Of course, as I was saying, there's a common historical background. There's still some common economic, political, social and cultural background. But what we need to keep in mind is that all these countries are getting more and more different, especially more than 30 years after independence. So besides Kazakhstan, indeed, all these countries, for example, if you take Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, Kazakhstan has a strong economic basis, with oil, gas, with uranium and so on, which is definitely not the case for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The economy of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan right now are based mostly on the development of hydroelectricity, plus a few resources like aluminum in Tajikistan. But we need to take into account that these countries, Tajikistan, these Central Asian countries were a creation of the Soviet Union. And these countries were not supposed to become independent later. All these countries were supposed to remain connected with each other, and especially with Russia. So Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan remains, economically speaking, very strongly dependent on Russia, for energy, for manufactured products, for food. Other actors are getting more engaged. I was mentioning China. I was mentioning also Turkey, which is trying to be more engaged now. But and I was also talking about remittances. Now Tajikistan, when you see that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are, I would say, following more Putin's direct, if I may say, is because it would be for them relatively difficult to go directly against Putin. The situation is different with Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, has bigger economic potential with economic resources, and especially now that we have, since 2016, we had a new president who is definitely not a Democrat, but who at least understood that it had to reopen the country. During the long reign of Karimov, the first president of Uzbekistan, Karimov closed the border. It really damaged significantly the economy, the trade, the business in all the country, and trade exchanges with all the region. Now Uzbekistan has reopened its border. Uzbekistan is trying to, having more and more investors, including from the United States. And thanks to this economic potential, thanks to this opening, Mirziyoyev, as the president of the country, has been really able to balance more, like Kazakhstan, to balance more its relation with Russia. And in a way, Uzbekistan has shown strong signs of resistance. First, because it never joined against the CSTO, and second, because for the last 3 or 4 years, Putin has been putting a lot of pressure on Central Asian countries, including on Uzbekistan and on Tajikistan, to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which so far Mirziyoyev has systematically refused, including recently. And then you have Turkmenistan, which since independence has been conducting a kind of strong isolationist policy in the name of its neutrality policy. Turkmenistan is a neutral country, a status which is recognized by the United Nations, which has enabled it to, let's say, really reduce its relations with Russia. Turkmenistan is officially part of the CIS, but has a kind of very low status, a kind of observer status. I don't remember the exact term. And this neutrality policy was a way, of course, for Turkmenistan to develop relations with its other partners, especially southern partners, first of all, Iran, Afghanistan too, including during the Taliban, with the Taliban that after, and then now again with the Taliban, or with Turkey. And to conclude, and on your question, so are these states satellite states, or could they be invaded? Frankly speaking, I'm skeptical I really don't think that Russia would be really willing to invade a Kazakhstan or to invade in all the Central Asian countries. It has all the means, to exert a strong influence on these countries. Frankly speaking, also, when we are hearing that before February 2022, that Russia might invade, might launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was skeptical. It was very hard for me to believe that. Well, look where we are now. So in a way, everything is possible. There are a lot of concerns in Kazakhstan. They are really wondering without the next on the list. And again, I'm skeptical. And again, Russia really has all the means to influence, to control these countries. But it also has all the means to influence and control Ukraine and manipulate Ukraine. So.
But it's an interesting question, rationally. Why would you take on all those troubles when you can have all the influence you need without doing so?
Exactly.
That's basically the proposition you think a rational Putin would confront.
Exactly. And another point here is that I'm not sure that other countries, the international community, and even not talking about Western countries, I'm talking about China. I'm really not sure that China would let Russia invade Kazakhstan, and China has been pretty clear on that.
Yeah, we're not going to run a betting pool on this, but it's an interesting thing to get perspective on. I'm going to, before opening the floor to questions, my last act here is going to, rather than calling on people, is going to be to offer you 3 propositions that I think may have some bearing on the future fate or future trajectory of the near abroad, at least near abroad that is already part of NATO, and ask you to reflect on them. And this is maybe an opportunity, if you want to do it, especially Matthew, to weave in a comment about Moldova, who we've left out so far, since it recently did not re-elect the Russian candidate, as I recall, in its most recent election. So the 3 propositions are these. It's said that in Tsarist times, since we were talking about the depth of history here and how far roots can be traced back, that in Tsarist times, the Tsar had fundamentally 2 responsibilities: to produce an heir and to add a piece of geography to the empire, something Louise and I discussed last night at dinner. If I were part of the ex-empire, that would raise for me the question of, does that imperative still operate, and where am I on the list? Second proposition is a proposition from my colleague on the faculty of the Institute of World Politics, Marek Chodachevich, who teaches geography, and I think one of his iron laws is that geography is destiny. And if geography is destiny, that might help explain the difference between the outcomes for the Baltics and the outcomes for the Caucasus, for example. It might also explain something about Moldova. And the third proposition is that there's a famous saying concerning Mexico. Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. Does the analogous expression, fill in the blank, country in the near abroad, so far from God, so close to Russia, apply? That more or less inevitably, and by the way, so close to Russia and so far from the United States and the West. If you put those propositions together, it kind of implies that the further from the West, the further distant geographically in terms of reach, former Soviet republics are, the more they're more or less destined, whether actually to be reincorporated in the Russian Empire or at least to be satellitized or heavily politically influenced by Russia. Okay, 3 propositions. What do you think about it?
Quick comment on Moldova. You're absolutely right. The Moldovans, by a reasonable margin, re-elected their pro-Western president, Maya Sandu, and by an incredibly slim margin, voted in support of essentially enshrining European Union integration in their constitution. but it was such a narrow margin that it was hardly a mandate. And the victory only happened because of a very large vote of Moldovan guest workers, outside of Moldova, which is a tough argument to make, right? These people who voted with their feet and already live in the European Union. So that's an easy one to run with propaganda while saying, hey, you don't get to decide what happens to this country, given all the same issues I just talked about. They're vulnerable to what may happen, especially in their Russian occupied separatist region of Transnistria. But you asked a series of pithy and cheeky questions that I'll answer with a few cheeky comments and just say, on the production of an heir and acquisition of territory, I'd ask the first question: where's Putin's heir? He hasn't done that, and I think this is where, in a way, the Tsarist system was more robust and resilient than the system Putin has built. It's a personalist autocracy. It's very unclear to me. I can see the system in a sense surviving, but it's very unclear to me how you have a succession that doesn't look like post-Stalin. Really. I mean, where there's real violence. There was real violence and the prospect of a lot more violence in 1953. And it was in some ways by the grace of the atheist communist God that it didn't happen, and Khrushchev was able to kind of secure control and take out Beria and do it. I don't see a peaceful, orderly succession to a figure after Putin that he has teed up. On geography and Mexico, just a couple of thoughts. There's this sort of famously, I think he's one of these guys like Sun Tzu, who is basically quoted for one thing over and over, the British geographer Halford McKinnon, right? The world island, right? Mm-hmm. I think it is still for Americans who are able to think beyond our shores, and it is an open question whether that is something that Americans want to do. But for Americans who are able to think beyond our shores, it is a strategic imperative to stop and revise policies that create a Russia-China axis with Iran, and even in some ways Turkey, though that's debatable, that effectively dominates the world island of Eurasia. That is whatever else we may pursue, and I run an organization which supports democracy in Russia, so I am all in favor of supporting movements towards democracy in any place around the world where it makes sense and so on. But whatever else we may do, the conditions will be more favorable for us if there is not an anti-American coalition dominating Eurasia, and less favorable for us if there is. And right now, there is, and we're on a path for that to become much, much worse. Look at the North Korean involvement in the war. And the last remark, just to trigger a little bit of reality, if the election last month, election a couple of weeks ago wasn't enough, is that Americans have these natural blessings, as my former Wilson Center colleague Aaron Miller likes to say, that we are surrounded by Mexico, Canada, and fish, and it makes it very, very hard, I think, to do the exercise that you have just called for of strategic empathy and seeing the world from a perspective where that is not even remotely common. I hope that we can in these next 4 years and beyond, but we'll see.
Okay. Sebastian, your reaction to my three propositions?
So, very briefly, the fact that Central Asian region was integrated with the Tsarist Empire and then the Soviet Empire makes me believe that Russia will never go on seeing this zone as a sort of influence, as a sort of near abroad, meaning that it has a right to have control on many sectors, including security, economy, etc. And that it will, not systematically, but it will try at least to prevent any country to have a strong influence in the region. And I'm not talking only about the West, I'm also talking about China. I was saying that there's a kind of agreement between China and Russia, but on the other hand, there are also some rivalries. And when I talk to I travel a lot to China to see how they use Central Asia and what they want to do there. And the official version is that, well, we agree with Russia. But then, during dinner, after one or two glasses of wine, then you feel the rivalries which are really growing between the two countries in the region. So basically, Russia will go on considering this Central Asia as its zone of influence. And on the geography, yes, of course, the geography of Central Asia is difficult. I mean, when you look at it, it's a landlocked region which doesn't facilitate economic development. Second, I mean, most of the countries around, I mean, are not to say pro-democracy, as I was saying. I mean, China, Russia, Iran, and so on. Does that mean that the situation cannot change? No. I mean, in terms of economic relations, yes, most of economic exchanges between Central Asia are done with Russia and with China. But there are also some opportunities. Turkey is working a lot on that. And there will be a lot to do. I mean, more, for example, with the United States or with the European Union. We're now talking a lot about the middle corridor, which would, in a way, disenclave the region. And just a last word in terms of politics. I mean, we also very often hear that Central Asian countries are victims of their geography because they are under the political influence of Russia and China, and it would be very difficult for them to neutralize. Yes, this is true, but on the other hand, if you look at another country, Mongolia, which is stuck, between Russia and China, between two very authoritarian countries, which of course have a strong influence, but Mongolia, I mean, is way more democratic than any other Central Asian countries. So again, I'm not saying that the situation is easy for Central Asia. They have to manage their relations with big neighbors, but medicine is not still possible.
Okay. Question from before, Ambassador Cobb.
So I'd like to ask Matt a question on his last.
Are you reading the microphone? Okay, it's coming. Chuck.
I'd like to follow up Matt's last strong conclusion that one of our highest priorities is to change from an anti-West to a pro-West. So if you were the Secretary of State, you were the new Secretary of State of the United States, what would be your series of recommendations to the President and the administration? Before you answer my question, let me just make one other comment. As a long-time, several decade trustee and involved at the Wilson Center, we lost several really top people, but losing Matt was one of the biggest losses the Wilson Center had. He was really a star at running our Kennan Institute, and I'm really delighted that he's here today. So, Mr. Secretary of State, how the heck are we implementing?
Well, thanks, Ambassador Cobb. It was a formative and wonderful experience, including getting to have exposure to yourself and other luminaries at the Wilson Center. One of the things that I did when I was there was I traveled as much as I could, taking advantage of, the Wilson Center in a lot of ways is like a mini State Department, right, with these regional programs. And one of my colleagues, Robert Daly, who ran at the Kissinger Institute, still runs the Kissinger Institute on China and the US. He and I did three separate trips that were China, Russia, Central Asia trips. And in our trip reports, we would always, of course, recycle the Mackinder line about the world island. And we would really try to channel this question, what is to be done? And I think we came away with three things, but they were always asymmetric vis-a-vis China and Russia. The asymmetries are the story of that relationship and the story of our triangular relations with the two. So one was have have a substantive agenda with Moscow and with Beijing. Don't let a time come to pass where the only thing you have is unidimensional. We only want one thing from them, or we want nothing from them. And unfortunately, and again, the fault for this, there's no disputing. Putin launched this war. It's a horrible war. It's illegal. But it's also been our choice whether to dismantle the Arctic agenda with Russia, whether to dismantle, to the extent that we could preserve the strategic stability agenda with Russia. We had, even after the war started, we had still the dialogue with Russia on Syria in the Middle East, because we have to. So I would posit that even in extremis, like the current situation, it is possible to have a kind of multi-layered agenda. We did this during the Cold War, right? We had multiple tracks. We were killing Soviets in Afghanistan actively. And in the Reagan administration, we had kind of the four buckets, right? We had the core nuclear relationship. We had regional conflicts, which was mostly Middle East. We had strategic stability, which was nuclear, that led to arms control agreements. And then we had I see Ambassador Gilmore's here. We had the Helsinki agenda. We had the human rights. We had lists of refuseniks that we wanted out of the Soviet Union, and it worked to some extent. With China, we did the same thing very actively and for a long time. And I think what has happened with both of those relationships, to our detriment, is that they have become kind of unidimensional, right? With China, it's this perception. Almost now it's like a mea culpa, like we failed. The integration of China into the rules-based international order didn't transform China, didn't cause the Communist Party to turn into the Democratic Party, right? And therefore nothing else matters, and we're heading into a new Cold War with them and conflict over Taiwan. I'm not a sinologist, but it would seem to me that having a multi-vector, multi-part agenda with Beijing and with Moscow, I don't know if it's Kissingerian, but like it helps to reset the triangle in our favor. So that's like big thing number one. Thing number two, and I'd let Sebastien comment on this more, but I remember hearing over and over and over when Central Asia, hands down, right? They're going to have to talk about the Baltics or the Caucasus or Ukraine. They all are just there, whatever of the West they can see, they're going to throw a rope to it, try to hook us and pull us in. Central Asia really is in that geographically isolated, difficult spot of being just completely surrounded. And yet, I remember hearing over and over and over for 20 years from Central Asian interlocutors, we want more America here, right? In whatever form, investments, cultural exchanges, just presence. That seems to me, they're sovereign countries, right? And I have friends who have served in the region, who are serving in the region now, who've been messed with by Russian intelligence actors on the ground. So it's not without risk, but they're sovereign countries. And if they say we want you here and we have any resources to be present, we should be present, right? American universities and cultural programs, especially now, because we can't do it in Russia, right? And we really can barely do it in Ukraine. We can send Americans there. And that is among some of the things we support in the foundation. So presence in Central Asia, and then again, not in a like zero sum, like we're going to push the Russians out or we're going to push the Chinese out. But business is business, man. People get excited when there's investment and opportunity. And then the last is, I think we have to be very conscious of how we lead by example. This is the version of Kennan that has just like somehow been lost to history. If you actually go back and read the Long Telegram, and you read the X article, and then you read all of Kennan's subsequent writings when he was, at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and gave like countless lectures. Actually, the core of the message is not the physical containment of the Soviet threat part. It's our system is a better system, and Soviet people are smart, and they will eventually see that, and that is what will cause their system to collapse and ours to prevail. But that still has to be true. Our system has to be a better system part, like that has to be true. And I think as Chinese are looking at, an overheated economy whose basic model of like savings and investment and kind of real estate bubble and stuff is falling apart, or as Russians are now experiencing this big boon of, state-driven military spending that's also overheating their economy, they're looking at the United States, which has also experienced a massive inflation, you know, a kind of backlash of blue collar working America against, like, you know, from their perspective, untenable economic conditions. And they're asking, how do Americans with their vaunted wealth and their system solve this? And I think how we solve it is not purely a domestic matter. This will be enormously determinative for intelligent people. We can never, like, remove ourselves just because we have distance and cultural barriers. These are smart human beings, you know, big societies, very sophisticated. They will look at how we solve these problems and they will say, wow, the American system enabled success. I want some of that success. Or they will say, remember back to my earlier remarks about looking at Ukraine and saying, let's wait and see how this one comes out.
Yes, Ambassador Gilmore.
Let me take a stab at this if I can, because what I really want to focus on is what I heard from the lectern, that it was essential that we break up this China-Russia alliance, which could dominate the Eurasian continent. And I've been puzzling over this question of how you get out of the Ukraine war without just simply following a policy of appeasement to Putin. My sense is Putin would like to get out of this, because I don't think that Russia can win this war. They can create terrible suffering, but I don't think they can conquer Ukraine. And I think Putin figured that out, and he'd like to get out of it. I can't think of any way to let him out of it because of his aggression. But the more to your point, the more we fight with him, then the closer he gets to China, and China sees this as an opportunity to export. So let me try to come to the question, this complicated question. I think an American character flaw that I always see in America's character is we always blame Americans first. We always think we're the cause of all this. If people are breaking bad and doing bad things, it's because the Americans caused it, which I don't buy. And what I guess I'm asking is this: what can we do? Nixon successfully broke this thing up, and my sense of things is that it is the Russians and the Chinese who have made a decision, and they have decided that they're going to break up the Western dominant order. History is moving in the direction of human rights and democracy, and these two countries don't like that and want to stop it. And therefore, they are taking initiative to try to stop that march of history. I think Putin is trying to reverse history. So I don't think he can do it. But the question is, how do you do something right now that can both break up that alliance and stop this Putin Russian aggression without just simply following a policy of appeasement, which I think will be a very short-term solution. I don't know if that's a clear question. I mean, it's complicated, but I'm trying to get to your insight about the two of you of what can be in fact done without just simply allowing Putin to begin the process of reversing history.
We're already 5 minutes into our break time, so if you guys could try a short answer to Ambassador Gilmore's question, that would be great. Who wants to go? Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, it's the question, right? I think the way that I would frame this is President-elect Trump has identified the problem, and he, I think, has prioritized it appropriately. He actually said two things in the debate that had me really perking up and saying, oh, I think he's got some pretty smart people advising him. One was, he said, the longer the war goes on, the worse it is for everyone, and we need to end it. And the second thing he said was, whether you like him or like it or not, because this was the context of him being accused of somehow rooting for Putin, which I don't think he is, by the way. He said, he's got nuclear weapons, and I don't want to give him a reason to use those. I think both of those things are right. I think that the four-part framework of President Biden's original policy on Ukraine remains exactly right, which is the country's got to survive as a sovereign state in control of its territory. The Biden policy has never said it's 1991 borders, Crimea and so on. The second point was Putin's got to suffer a strategic defeat in Ukraine. The third is the rules-based international order needs to be reinforced and not eroded, which is a message to China, right, principally. And the fourth is no escalation, no U.S. Russian direct escalation, and especially no nuclear. On the fourth, I think we're in really dangerous territory today, right? The U.S. embassy being evacuated, not without reason. That feels like direct escalation if we have credible reason to think missiles are going to drop on the U.S. embassy in Kiev, which up to now has not been targeted, and they haven't done that. So something's changing, and you can fill in the blank as to what it was and read the newspapers. So I have a lot of concerns about where the policy has drifted to from the initial articulation by President Biden and Jake Sullivan, and I have some, I guess, optimism that President-elect Trump has identified the right priorities, where I won't say I'm drawing a complete blank because I'm not allowed to, otherwise Chuck Cobb will go back and say, good job getting rid of the Wilson Center. But I don't have the perfect framework to give President Trump about how you achieve that. I can tell you what it's not. So it's not going to be sort of a Trump, Kim Jong-un, some personal diplomacy thing. That's just not going to do it. It's true that Putin has personalized this war. It is about his personal legitimacy and survival. I'm concerned that the corollary of that is actually the real resolution of this conflict is in a post-Putin world, which might come sooner than we think, right? Nobody was ready for the death of Stalin in April of 1953. This could happen, and I actually hope very much. I won't say more, but I hope the United States government is preparing for that eventuality. So it's not going to be a personalized solution. What the Ukrainians are going to need, if NATO membership is impossible, which it is seeming like it's not realistically possible. The Germans are again signaling the exact same things on that they always have. I think the United States is broadly in the same position it's been in. President Biden was asked, do you want this to be your legacy? And he didn't answer, which is an answer. So if NATO membership is not on the table, the Ukrainians need a security guarantee. No more sort of games about assurances like in the Budapest Memorandum. They need something that they can take home and say, whatever the shape of my home now in the wake of this war, and it won't probably be the same as it was before, I can be confident that I can hold on to this. Because otherwise Zelensky is finished, right? I mean, he goes back to the Ukrainian people. Why did we sacrifice for the last 2.5 years to continue to live under the threat of another Russian invasion? That's impossible. That's the core thing that Ukrainians need. And the United States of America is capable of delivering it. I cannot prescribe for you exactly how. I think the thing the Russians need, this is where it gets trickier. We may have to play a bit of a waiting game vis-a-vis Putin, because I think even the Russian system of today, all around and below Vladimir Putin, is looking for a way back into the global economy. I think in that sense, sanctions have been effective. They have very clearly signaled to the Russians what it means to lack direct access to Western investment and Western technology. And I think that's something that's very attractive for the Russian system. The personal side of it, this idea of like, you can block them from their villas in the south of France and suddenly they'll go assassinate the boss. That was always a fantasy. But I think that sort of being welcomed back to the councils of state and investment of the wider global system, that's been pretty effective. I just wouldn't, and again, I don't exclude that this will be part of the approach in the new administration. I wouldn't necessarily put it on the table right away. I would say that's something that probably has to come over time in maybe a post-Putin system. But those are the two, in my view, those are the two big things.
Sebastien, do you have something to add?
Not many. I mean, I don't have much to add. I mean, just if I had to focus on the case of Central Asia, when we talk about this alliance between China and Russia, it's going to be very difficult, to break it into a region. That being said, because China and Russia have so many investments, are so much engaged. So I mean, we just don't have the means, economic means, to be so strongly engaged there to compete with Russia and China, even at the political level. That being said, I'm going to go what you were saying. Central Asian countries are willing to, and populations, governments are willing to have many more US engagement to counteract the influence of Russia and China. And to be honest, we unfortunately do not have a good image now in Central Asia. Why? Because Central Asian people are very disappointed. They have a feeling to have been used by the United States during the military operation in Afghanistan, and after the withdrawal, they have a feeling that the United States have done much less with this country. So there are some ways to be more present, to say to China and Russia, hey, we're here, we can do things by being more engaged. I mean, some economic sectors, by being engaged in the development sector, for example, in education, in health, in environmental issues, by being more engaged in the business sector. So yeah, that's probably my advice for the next step.
So there, ladies and gentlemen, you have it, our first morning panel. I think we should thank our panelists